Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Tactics Board. I'm sure many of us are still recovering from the trip to Stoke at the weekend, but Norwich City are already back in action tomorrow when they take on Preston North End. It feels like the Championship schedule is really back now, with a few midweek games coming up. That starts at Deepdale, and of course here today we're going to discuss the game from a tactical point of view. I'm also going to take a look at whether it might be the time for Norwich to play a back three, and I'm going to give you my predicted 11 for the game. We're going to start there, so without further ado, here's the side I think Johannes Hoff-Torp will choose tomorrow evening. So I've gone for George Long in goal, Kellen Fisher at right back, Shane Duffy and Jose Cordoba in the centre of defence, with Callum Doyle at left back, Kenny McLean, Oscar Schwartau and Anis Ben Slimane in the centre of midfield, with Ante Sienats on the right, Borja Sainz on the left and Josh Sargent on his own through the middle. Up front, plenty of discussion to be had around this team, but I'm going to start in midfield, where I think Torp has the biggest dilemma of all. Of course, Marcelino Nunez came off in the first half in the Potteries, and it doesn't look very likely at all that he'll feature tomorrow. So there is a decision to be made, especially in such a key area after such a fantastic start to the season for the Chilean. There are a few options there: Gabriel Forsyth, Schwartau, as I mentioned, Amankwa Forson as well, even Emiliano Marcondes, who very recently wasn't even really on the radar, but now looks like he could be a starting option. But Forsyth hasn't really featured too much in the last few weeks, so I'd be surprised if he just gets chucked in from the start. Schwartau I've gone for because I think you look at the first few substitutions that Torp has made in recent games, it feels like right now he is at the top of that pecking order when Nunez isn't available. You've got Marcondes, who actually has really impressed me in his two cameos, adds a bit of energy, a bit of physicality and a dynamism that maybe the competition lacks. But right now, given the fitness element, the fact that he didn't play a competitive game for several months and has only been training with Norwich for a few weeks now, I'd be surprised if Torp did chuck him in from the start. I don't think you could get much more than 45 minutes out of him, if that. And it would be a surprise to see him start there, although he could be an option as an early substitution, given that's a way that Torp likes to use the rotation as well. But I think just too early for him to start as well. Forson probably is the one that fits best into the system and maybe looks the most like a Torp type midfield player. But right now he looks so low on confidence. Started really, really well after signing for the club. A couple of really good performances, but recently he's barely been able to pass the ball forward, and I wouldn't doubt the ability that there is in that player, but right now it feels like he is a bit raw and there is some work to do to get him up to the standard that I think we saw he can show early in his time in a yellow and green shirt. But right now certainly doesn't feel like the moment for him. So I think it will be Schwartau, who looks to be at the top of the pecking order at the moment, but also I think there's something to prove for him because his recent performances haven't been amazing either. Plenty of running off the ball, plenty of physicality from him, but for someone in such a crucial area, as a creative player by all accounts, you'd want to see him on the ball more often, trying to drive forward and make things happen. But we haven't really seen that from him, and that's why it feels like there probably will be a drop-off from Nunez, and that's something that Norwich will have to deal with. But I think that's the choice that Torp will make, albeit I'm not absolutely certain given the number of options available. The rest of the pitch, I think there may well be changes, but it's quite hard to pinpoint where they actually will be, because you look at some of the areas where they've got decent backup options who could come in, and actually the areas are pretty strong anyway. You know, you look at up front where Ante Sienats has just scored his first goal for the club and is someone we know can play up front, but you've got Josh Sargent there and you aren't likely to displace him. Then Ben Krezene, who's been pretty impressive as a substitute in recent weeks, hasn't really put a foot wrong in yellow and green, but is behind Callum Doyle, who is so crucial to the build-up play and the way that Norwich play. At right back, Jack Stacey, obviously an experienced player who didn't look terrible at the start of the season, even though there was maybe room for improvement. But Kellen Fisher has been excellent, and in wide areas, you know, Sienats, there aren't many who are really pushing them, especially when you consider Cade Gordon, who it feels like was in receipt of a bit of momentum after the last few weeks, didn't even come on as a substitute against Stoke. So although it feels like there might be changes, and I might be proven quite wrong there, on a percentage basis, it's quite hard to guess which one that is. So I've played it safe. I might be wrong, and there might end up being 5 or 6 changes. But I don't see where Torup can make those changes, really, even though I'm sure he would like to be able to, given the load that there's been on the players in recent weeks and some of the games they've got coming up. So that is definitely something to watch out for. It might be not the best prediction for the starting 11, but just as a safe bet, I think it's tough to see where Torup will make those changes, to be honest. On to Preston, and their recent form suggests it won't be the easiest test whatsoever for Norwich. Not the hardest of fixtures in recent weeks, although they did beat Coventry at the weekend, who have started really poorly, but everyone recognises have a pretty good squad, and beat them 1-0. You look at the way that those results have gone, and you can tell the way that they play almost. It's very defence-focused. They've kept 3 clean sheets in a row, and against a team like Norwich who want to attack first, who want to be proactive, you can look at that one of 2 ways. One would be that Norwich will have plenty of the ball probably, and they'll be able to attack that Preston defence. But 2, they like to have space to exploit, and they like teams to come onto them so that they can then go and play in behind. And I don't think Preston will be the most desperate side to get high up the pitch and leave space in behind and try to press Norwich and win the ball in the offensive half. Instead, they'll probably sit a little bit deeper, probably a mid-block, and those are the situations that Norwich maybe struggled with a little bit against Stoke. When Stoke were pressing high, they were able to get the ball through to their midfielders and progress it into the wingers and Josh Sargent up front. But when Stoke just sat deep, they played very narrow, stopped Norwich playing the ball through the lines in that condensed space. That was where Norwich struggled to really create chances, and it didn't look as dynamic, and it didn't look as progressive or quick, or like there was as much interchangeable movement. So if Preston do things similarly to them, then you can see the struggle for Norwich. I think they're well aware of that style of play. Paul Heckingbottom has actually spoken about it in the lead up to the game, that he can see that style evolving, and I'm sure that Stoke game actually gave him some ideas as to how to combat it. In terms of offensively, they are pretty direct. They use the wide areas very well. They've got some big presences up there, and they will look to get into the final third quickly to create chances in that sense. They've got good long distribution from Freddie Woodman, their goalkeeper, and in that sense, they're quite good at that. But you look at the defenders that Norwich have got, Jose Cordoba, Shane Duffy, aerially, those are threats that they should be able to deal with, but it's probably down to the second balls, whether the likes of Fisher and Doyle or whoever plays at fullback can go from those inverted roles back out wide again to stop those wingers getting involved. And it will be a test in those wide areas, which maybe plays a little bit again into that sort of back 3 discussion that I'm going to come on to. But in terms of the test that they'll face, it's a typical Championship one, maybe in slightly colder temperatures than those players have been used to in recent weeks. An evening game quickly after a tough trip to Stoke. It definitely will test the mettle of those Norwich players, so it'll be interesting to see how they adapt. But in terms of the system that they'll face, not loads of nuance to it, but definitely ways that they can hurt Norwich and areas where Norwich will need to be switched on. Now, I wanted to finish with a little bit of a discussion around whether a back 3 might be the solution for Norwich at the moment. I've seen a bit of talk about it on social media between Norwich fans, and it was actually something we looked into on the most recent episode of the Pinkham podcast. And it's something you can understand that people are looking at and seeing the benefits that there could be for Norwich, especially personnel-wise, where in midfield it looks like Nunez will be out for this game, and a midfield 2 of McLean and Slimane actually is quite a good one when you look at their form, the combination of physicality, creativity, defensive qualities that there is in those 2. And it would negate the need for someone else to come in and maybe for there to be a slight drop-off from Nunez to the next cab off the rank, as it were. So in that situation, you can see personnel-wise why it would help. Also in that left side of defence, where you're struggling to get Ben Crozene involved despite his good performances in recent weeks, because Callum Doyle and Jose Cordoba are so influential in the system and so essential to the way that Norwich want to play. Whereas if you went to a back 5, you could have Cordoba sliding over to the centre of those three in the middle. You could have Callum Doyle then coming into a left-sided centre-back role, and you could have Crozene in there, meaning most of Norwich's best players, especially in Nunez's absence, would be in that team, and it does provide a solution in that sense. Also for the inverted fullbacks, which in this case of course would be wing backs, where we've seen a little bit of a weakness in terms of the challenge of getting out of that midfield role that they're almost playing in possession, to then having to defend deep and out wide when opposition teams can get the ball into those areas, especially with some of the qualities that Preston have. That could be a real problem. Whereas with a back five, they would have that cover out wide who could hold things up until there was a bit more time for Fisher and Crozene in this example to come back and help with that defending and actually provide probably some numerical superiority in those wide areas. So you can see some of the benefits to it tactically, but in the long term, given that Torup is trying to implement this system over a number of years, probably going to something very different in terms of what he'd be asking his players to do this early on in the project feels fairly unlikely, especially given how sort of philosophical he can be and how open he's been about the fact that it is a period of transition, and that despite the fairly good start to the season, the players are still learning the roles required of them in his system. So that's why, as I'm sure you've noticed, I don't expect him to do that. But there are definitely some benefits. Another one of the negatives, however, is the fact that in the short term, I think the midfield would be a little bit exposed. We know how important control is to Torup's system. And when you've got that two in midfield, as we actually saw when Norwich beat Watford 4-1 a few weeks ago, it is hard to get that dominance in midfield. It's hard to win that physical battle, especially when most teams in this league play with a three. And as good as Slimane and McLean have been, it would be quite difficult for Norwich to control possession and to control territory in central areas, as they love to do, when they only had a midfield two in there. It might be a bit easier to progress the ball from defence, but then there aren't many options for those centre-backs to find, and there are plenty of players who can go and defend and provide a mid-block and stop Norwich playing through those thirds. So some positives and negatives, but given the stage of the Hofball project, I wouldn't expect Torup to go to that, but I can definitely understand the discussion around it. Either way, there will be plenty of interesting themes to watch out for in the Preston game. Of course, we'll have everything covered for you across our channel. So go to pinkun.com/subscribe if you aren't already subscribed, and you'll have access to all of those features. Plenty of excellent stuff. Thank you very much for joining me on Tactics Board. I'll see you again very, very soon, given the scheduling. Looking forward to it, and I'm sure I'll see some of you at Deepdale.